The original name of the World Bank is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So our initial aim was to help to rebuild war-ravaged Europe after World War II. So I think intrinsically we're engaged in and have been engaged in the process of rebuilding. But our linkage with humanitarian efforts is a bit newer, and it comes from the realization that, first of all, we're seeing more and more of international development assistance going to humanitarian and crisis response and not to classic longer-term development. And this is quite disturbing. So over the last 10 years, it's gone from 3% to 15% of official development assistance. That's $25 billion a year, money that could be invested in long-term development but is going into short-term response. The second reason that we're concerned about this link between humanitarian assistance and development is because the way that humanitarian investment is done has consequences for a country's long-term development. If it's done well, then it creates the basis for recovery. If it's done in an incomplete fashion, then you have problems that fester and tend to keep people in poverty and reduce economic development. The big new thing at the World Bank is to be able to draw together our different resources to respond to crisis in a unified way. So we're creating something called the Global Crisis Risk Management Platform, which will allow us to use our financial instruments, our relationships with governments, our partnerships to more effectively respond with the resources that we're able to mobilize to different sorts of crises in the developing world. Our panel was all about shelters and settlement planning in the recovery process after a disaster. And this is fundamental for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the housing sector that's typically most affected that incurs the highest amount of damages and losses after a disaster. So just from the sheer numbers, it's a priority. Second, the way that communities recover is critical for the overall reconstruction process. And if we don't get housing right, if we don't move people from temporary shelters to longer-term housing, if we don't rebuild communities, it's very difficult to have an effective recovery. So often in a disaster, we're engaged in an ad hoc response. And to the extent that countries can be better prepared by having the institutional arrangements in place, the financing mechanisms, the implementation arrangements, and the policies in place before a disaster strikes, they're able to respond more quickly and recover more quickly. And the real tragedy is that typically what we see is after a disaster hits, there's a gap between that event and when people start to recover their lives and livelihoods. And that delay can be up to a year in some cases. During that period, people are suffering, families are struggling, and there are economic costs incurred. So we need to be prepared in part to help accelerate that time period and recover more quickly. I'll give you one example of how we're using advanced technology to better understand what's happening on the ground after a disaster or a conflict. And in conflict situations where it's difficult to be on the ground to assess what's happening, we're able to use a combination of remote sensing from satellites, social media analytics, and data from third parties who are actually on the ground, the NGOs, the Red Cross, and so on, and compare that with official statistics to get a real sense of what's happening. I'll give you one simple example. We were trying to understand how functional the hospital was in Aleppo, and ISIS claimed that they had taken it out, but we were getting social media reports from tweets and YouTube video posts and Facebook information that the X-ray ward was functional, the maternity ward was functional, and we were able to put together a picture through remote sensing and social media information about what was really happening in that hospital and how much of it would need to be rebuilt after peace comes to Syria. It's been a great networking opportunity. It's drawing together people in the Washington community and beyond who are, in a sense, a community of practice, but who don't have the opportunity to meet that often, to come together, to discuss, to learn, to share, and to think about the future. We wanted to share our experience at the World Bank with post-disaster recovery. We wanted to learn about good practice from others, and we wanted to be able to use this as an opportunity to both reinforce and develop partnerships. I would absolutely recommend the summit to my colleagues in the international development community as an opportunity to efficiently and effectively share information and learn about good practice.